Hey guys, welcome to my Blender tutorial series, and in this tutorial we'll be going over the Blender UI. The Blender UI, this tutorial is pretty important because in this tutorial we'll be going over basically how you'll be navigating with Blender for the rest of however long you do Blender. So let's get right into it. And so arguably the most important part of the Blender UI is the viewport. We went over this in the last tutorial, but basically this is where you'd interact with your model and learn how to rotate your camera and get better angles so you could mess around with them, just scaling them, grabbing them, or rotating them. Of course we'll be going over all three of those later, but as of now, this is the viewport. And the viewport, you have the toolbox here. You can activate it by pressing T. You can drag it to however it is comfortable for you, but I prefer it along the dead edge here, so I do that. In the viewport, you can pick between object mode, edit mode, sculpt mode. We'll go over all of those soon. These are the different viewport shading options. By clicking on these, you can see how your meshes would look under different circumstances. This is wireframe mode, whereas you can see all the edges become solid lines. This is just solid mode, where you usually don't see color. This is material preview mode. This is mostly used to preview the materials that are colored. And then you last is rendered mode, where if you put certain light object, it's actually influenced on the scene, as you see here. But most of the time we'll be working in solid mode because it's the fastest. That's it for the viewport mostly. And next we'll be going over to the timeline. Here it doesn't have to be the timeline actually. You can mess around with all these panels and you could change them to whatever you want, but by default here is the timeline. Again, Blender uses keyframe based animation system. So you'd take your object or your mesh somewhere, you'd hit a keyframe, and then you'd move somewhere along the timeline, move your object again, place another keyframe, and when you scrub through it, you'll see it translates smoothly. And this here is the scene collection. So if you name all your objects correctly, for example, cube, you'll have cube 1, cube 2, cube 3, cube 4, cube 5, and let's say it's all just a mess. If you want to specifically find cube 6, let's say, you can go to the scene collection here, you can click on cube 6 and you can center it, and here it is. This is cube 6, and now when the cube is behind other objects, as you can see, its edges are outlined, so we can vaguely see where the cube is. And this here is the properties tab. Now in the properties tab, this is actually really useful. You can go over render properties, you can go over output properties, view layer properties. Here you can have modifiers, here you can have particle effects, here you can have physics, here you can have materials. There's a lot you can do in this properties tab, and honestly it's really useful. And in the render properties tab, you can either pick Eevee, which is more of a funky animation type, or cycles, which is realistic. By default, in Blender 2.8 or above, it'll keep you at Eevee, but if you want to go to cycles for realism, you can. For the defaults that come in when you open Blender are layout, modeling, sculpting, UV editing, texture painting, and the others. Of course, here in the sculpting tab, you can mess around with the objects and do whatever you want. But back to layout, and as you can see, I made something, well, really it was just a modification of the cube from the beginning, but I made a little something, and the shape of the cube stayed on. So these are not separate tabs. They can have different viewpoints, but they are still the same objects carried through, just in different forms. And really that concludes today's tutorial. I tried to keep it short because the UI is pretty important, so I don't want to stuff your head with too many other things. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.